Have you ever spent years next to someone loyal, steady, always there and realized only too late that they were the one thing you couldn't afford to lose? Elliot Hartman, a man who built an empire with logic and silence, had one unspoken truth. He trusted no one, except her. Claire Reynolds wasn't just his assistant. She was his compass, his calm, his only real connection. But he never told her that. Not until the night she danced with another man. A quiet waltz on polished floors. And something inside him cracked. What would you do if the only person who truly saw you stopped looking your way? Would you admit what you'd buried for years, or stand still as it slipped away? This is not a story about betrayal. It's about silence, timing, and the words we leave unsaid until it's almost too late. And maybe, just maybe, you've been there too. Stay with us, because what comes next might feel a little too close to home. If this speaks to something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more stories that heal, connect, and remind us you're not alone. Let's begin. The ballroom shimmered under a canopy of soft golden chandeliers. Warm jazz floated from a quartet tucked in the corner, weaving through conversations and clinking glasses. Waiters moved like shadows between tables, balancing trays of champagne and crab cakes. Laughter rose in polite waves, rising and falling like the tide. Elliot Hartman stood near the edge of the room, his back straight, a glass of bourbon in his hand that had yet to be sipped. His eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd not out of interest, but habit. The room bore his name. It was the annual Hartman Foundation Gala, a charity event he'd started over a decade ago to soften the edges of his public image. It had grown over time bigger, flashier, louder. But for him, it had only grown more hollow. He never liked events like these. Not really. Too much noise, too many masks. But tonight was different, because tonight, Claire Reynolds was dancing, and not with him. She moved across the floor with the kind of grace that made people stop mid-sentence. Her dark green dress hugged her silhouette like it had been made only for her. Her auburn hair was pinned up, soft tendrils framing her face. But it wasn't the dress or the hair. It was the smile. Full, effortless, real. And she was smiling at another man. The man dancing with her wore a navy suit and a grin that Elliot already despised. His hand rested too confidently at the small of Claire's back. His steps were fluid. Practiced he'd done this before. Too many times. Probably. Elliot tightened his grip on the glass. He didn't know the man. Didn't need to. Because Elliot Hartman, CEO of Hartman & Co., a man who had built his empire on control and restraint, felt something in his chest he hadn't let himself feel in years. Jealousy. Not the immature kind. Not the green-eyed, adolescent flare of envy. No. This was the cold, calculated kind. The kind that made him question things. Made him wonder if the very person who had been by his side for 3 years without ever asking for anything had just decided to stop waiting. He looked away. A part of him wanted to walk out, but he didn't. Instead, he watched, like he always did, from the sidelines, silent, controlled. And then, as if the universe wasn't done with him, Claire looked up right at him. It lasted no more than a second, but it was enough. Her smile faltered, just slightly. Her gaze softened, almost apologetic. Then she blinked, and it was gone. replaced by the same effortless grin she gave everyone else. She turned back to her dance partner. And Elliot Hartman? Cracked. Just a little. Just enough to notice. He hadn't realized how much of his day started and ended with Claire, the way she handed him his coffee without asking, the way she always anticipated the exact kind of silence he needed, whether focused, tense, or simply tired, the way her presence filled a room without ever asking for space. He'd always told himself it was professionalism, that she was simply the most competent assistant he'd ever had. But standing there, glass sweating in his hand, he knew it wasn't just that. Claire Reynolds wasn't just his assistant. She was the only person who'd ever gotten past his walls, and he'd never told her, never even hinted. Because what do you say to someone who has held your life together quietly? To someone who made it easy for you to never feel? You say nothing. You say nothing until one night they laugh with someone else, and it sounds like music you were never invited to hear. "Beautiful evening," a voice said beside him. Elliot didn't turn. He didn't have to. Richard Halberd, an old family acquaintance, long-time donor, and the kind of man who never missed a chance to poke at a moment. "It is," Elliot replied, eyes still fixed on Claire. "Is that your assistant out there?" Elliot finally turned, slowly. Richard chuckled, lifting his drink. Didn't know she had that in her. Elliot said nothing, because the truth was, he hadn't known either. Not really. And that scared him more than he wanted to admit. When the music ended, Claire dipped in a small curtsy, laughing at something her partner whispered in her ear. And Elliot knew. This night would change something. Not because of what happened on the dance floor, but because of everything that never had. 2 weeks before the gala, Boston was caught in one of those early spring limbos, too cold for comfort, too warm for winter coats. The city pulsed with movement. But inside the 42nd floor of Hartman & Co., time ticked in quieter rhythms. Claire Reynolds walked through the glass-paneled hallway with the confidence of someone who had long stopped second-guessing her place in the building. A sleek leather folder tucked under one arm, coffee in the other, heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Her days began before sunrise and ended after dark. She didn't complain. Never did. Elliot Hartman, as usual, was already in his office by the time she arrived, white shirt, sleeves rolled, blazer neatly folded over his chair. The skyline stretched behind him like a painting. He was reviewing 3 acquisition briefs, 2 budget breakdowns, and a contract dispute memo. And yet, the moment she stepped in, he looked up, not with a smile. Elliot rarely smiled first, but he nodded, like clockwork. "Morning," she said. "You're early." "You're earlier," she replied, placing his coffee just left of his laptop, exactly where he preferred it. They never talked much in the mornings. Their routine was a kind of choreography, predictable, precise, unspoken. Claire handled the chaos. Elliot executed the decisions. Together, they built a rhythm few people dared interrupt. 3 years like that. 3 years of finishing each other's thoughts without finishing sentences. Of protecting each other's time, sanity. And sometimes, though, neither would admit it, their solitude. They had never crossed a line. Not even close. But the space between them had always felt fragile, like something both sacred and dangerous. Claire never asked about Elliot's past, though she knew his divorce had left him quieter, sharper. She never brought up his late nights in the office, or the way he stared at the skyline for minutes at a time. And Elliot never asked why she often skipped lunch, or why she sometimes stepped into empty conference rooms to take calls with a voice too gentle for work-related matters. He just knew. Claire had a younger brother, Miguel. In college, their parents were long gone, and Claire was all he had. Once, Elliot overheard her talking to Miguel. The call was brief. She laughed softly and said, "Don't worry, I'm fine. I'm not tired. It's just a big week." She was tired, and still, she never let it show. That morning, Claire handed him the quarterly investor brief, highlighted and annotated, with 2 flagged concerns in the footnotes that no one else had noticed. Elliot scanned the first page. "You stayed late again." It was quiet. She shrugged. "Helps me focus?" "You could have let finance handle this. They don't double-check numbers from Tokyo before shipping final drafts. You do. So I do." There it was. That line between them. Not flirty, not intimate, just something. More. He looked at her, really looked. And for a flicker of a moment, something stirred. He wondered how long it had been since anyone had asked Claire how she was, without expecting her to be fine. Before he could say anything, she stepped back. "Oh, by the way," she said, trying to sound casual. Thomas Weller reached out. "He's back in Boston. Wants to grab coffee." Elliot blinked once. She didn't notice. "Thomas," he repeated. "We were in the same poli-sci cohort in college. He's doing something in green tech now, venture-backed startup, and he contacted you." His tone wasn't accusatory, just flat. Claire hesitated. "He said he remembered I was working at Hartman. That's all." Elliot looked back at the report, lips pressed. Claire watched him a moment, then added, "He's not here for me. He's here for business. He's pitching to investors at the gala next week." That made him pause. "Of course," she said lightly. "If you're uncomfortable, I'll cancel." He looked up again. "You don't need my permission?" Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Noted. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meetings, prep calls, and press briefings for the gala. Elliot threw himself into the work, as he always did when something unsettled him. Claire, for her part, was as efficient as ever. But something had shifted. Small things. She didn't ask if he wanted tea in the afternoon. He didn't check her meeting notes like he usually did. They still moved in sync, but now it felt like a performance. Like both of them were pretending the music hadn't changed. The night before the gala, Elliot stood by the window long after Claire had gone home. The lights of Boston blurred against the glass. He thought about the first time he'd hired her, how she'd walked into his office, poised, direct, unapologetically competent. "I'm not here to be your secretary," she'd said. "I'm here to keep your world functional so you can do what you do best." She had kept her promise, but he'd never asked what she needed in return. Now he wasn't sure if she'd been waiting for him to ask or had simply stopped waiting altogether. The next night, when Claire stepped onto the dance floor with Thomas Weller, Elliot realized the silence between them had finally spoken, and it said, "You waited too long." The Monday after the gala was unusually gray. Boston's skyline looked like it had been sketched in pencil flat, smudged, blurred by a fine mist that hadn't quite turned to rain. Inside Hartman & Co., The fluorescent lights hummed softly, the office waking up with its usual quiet efficiency. Phones rang, coffee brewed, doors whispered open and shut. But in Elliot Hartman's corner office, everything felt still. He sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled, blazer draped across the back of his chair, eyes staring at a projection chart he hadn't processed in 10 minutes. His coffee had gone cold. The morning meeting with legal had ended 20 minutes ago. He couldn't recall a word of it. Claire Reynolds had said exactly 14 words to him since arriving. 14. All of them business. No eye contact. No shared silences. No casual updates on vendor delays or investor mood swings. Just pure, polished professionalism, the kind that felt colder than anger. He'd expected distance, but not this kind. Not the kind where even her footsteps down the hall felt quieter. Not the kind where her laugh, usually soft, rare, and unexpected, was now absent entirely. He didn't even know what she was thinking, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He tried to replay the moment her on the dance floor, twirling under chandeliers, the green silk of her dress catching the light. Thomas Weller had held her with the ease of familiarity, the casualness of someone who knew her before the suits and schedules. It wasn't just that she danced. It was that she laughed, open, unrestrained. Not the polite laugh she gave clients or the quiet smile she gave him when he said something sarcastic. No, this was different. It was the kind of laugh that meant something had shifted. The kind that made Elliot feel like he was suddenly on the outside of something he didn't even know he wanted to be part of. He hadn't spoken about it, hadn't brought it up. That wasn't his way. He dealt with facts, not feelings. But facts didn't help him now. Not when every moment since had been marked by Claire's silence. He watched her through the glass as she worked at her desk, methodical, composed, hair pinned in a clean twist. She was speaking to someone from PR on the phone. He couldn't hear her words, but he knew the tone, calm, reassuring, precise. The same tone she used when everything inside was shaking. He knew it because it was his tone too. Claire was hurting, and he didn't know how to reach her. Not without undoing everything he'd spent a decade building: distance, control, boundaries. His fortress. He thought of saying something, anything. But the words stuck. What would he even say? I didn't like seeing you with someone else. No. You looked happy, and I didn't know that would make me feel like hell. Too vulnerable. I think I might be losing you, and I'm the one who never made you feel seen. That one almost came out, but didn't. Instead, he opened a file on his laptop and buried himself in the quarterly audit report. Numbers were easier. They didn't require trust. They didn't change their meaning based on how you said them. It was past 6 when Claire stepped into his office with a report in hand. He looked up, surprised to see her still here. Her tone was clipped, but not unkind. Investor recap from the gala. 3 prospects asked to follow up. One of them was from Weller's team. He nodded. Thank you. She turned to leave, but stopped. Elliot, she said, without facing him. Was I out of line the other night? He froze. The room stretched between them like a fault line. No, he said finally. You weren't. Claire nodded. Her posture softened just a little, but she didn't turn around. You seemed upset. He exhaled through his nose. You were dancing with an old friend. Yes. She waited, then added quietly, "You've never said anything before? About anything like that? I don't comment on your personal life." She turned now, her expression unreadable. "No, you don't. And maybe that's the problem. A beat." Then she walked out. And this time, Elliot didn't stop her. Because she was right. He didn't comment, didn't ask, didn't show. He observed. That had always been his survival method. He saw everything. He processed. He calculated. But feeling, that required risk. And risk had a cost he wasn't sure he knew how to pay. Later that night, Elliot stood in his kitchen, untouched bourbon in hand, the lights of Boston bleeding through the windows behind him. He had everything he'd ever wanted. The company, the influence, the silence. And yet, he'd never felt further from what he needed. Because now, that silence echoed with a laugh that wasn't meant for him, and he didn't know if he'd ever hear it again. The office had never felt this tense. It wasn't loud. Hartman & Co. was never loud. But there was something different in the way people spoke in hushed tones, the way they glanced at closed doors, the way even the printers seemed to hum a little softer. And Elliot Hartman noticed it all. His eyes weren't on spreadsheets that morning. They were on the quiet absence of familiarity, on the way Claire Reynolds hadn't once stopped by his office, hadn't offered her usual brief comment after the weekly investor call, hadn't even paused to make sure his coffee hadn't gone cold. It had twice. At 10:22 a.m., he saw her walking with Thomas Weller down the hallway toward the executive lounge. Claire was holding a file, one of his files, and Thomas, dressed in a charcoal suit that tried too hard to be casual, was grinning as if the world belonged to him. Elliot's jaw clenched. He wasn't the jealous type. At least, that's what he told himself. But something about the way Thomas leaned in, how Claire tilted her head just slightly to listen, how her shoulders relaxed, he didn't like it. He didn't like it at all. He buzzed his assistant line. No answer. Of course not. She was with him. 2 hours later, Claire stepped into Elliot's office, file in hand. She looked composed, flawless, as always, but there was a coolness in her tone that hadn't been there a week ago. These are the projections from the Weller meeting. His startup's pitch is outlined in the second tab. He's hoping to get your attention during the next strategy session. Elliot didn't look up right away. And did he get yours? Claire blinked. Excuse me. He finally raised his eyes. Your attention? He seems to be getting a lot of it lately. The air shifted. Claire's tone sharpened. Thomas is a professional contact. This is work. So was I, Elliot replied, too quickly, until I wasn't. She stared at him, stunned into silence for a beat. Elliot, she said quietly, I don't know what you're trying to say. Neither did he. Not clearly. Not in a way that wouldn't come out as something it wasn't. I'm saying, he muttered, standing and walking toward the window, that I don't trust him. You don't even know him. I know the type. And what type is that? The opportunistic kind? The kind that smiles too easily? The kind who shows up out of nowhere and inserts himself where he doesn't belong? Claire folded her arms. So that's what this is about. He turned slowly. What? You think Thomas is trying to get close to you through me? His silence answered for him. Claire exhaled, her hands falling to her sides. I've worked for you for 3 years. I've never asked for more. I've never compromised a single confidential file. I've never crossed a line. And this is where you land. It's not about crossing lines. It's about knowing where they are. And who gets to draw them? She asked, her voice rising. You. Someone has to. Claire stepped back, blinking hard. You're not worried about Thomas. You're worried about me. He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. Let me be clear, she said. Thomas is a friend. We had coffee. We talked about our lives. He made me laugh. And for 10 minutes that night, I remembered what it felt like to be a person and not a machine. The words landed harder than he expected. Claire's voice softened. Do you know how long it's been since someone asked me how I was doing and actually meant it? He didn't answer, 'cause he hadn't. Not once. And he hated that she was right. That night, Elliot didn't go home. He stayed in his office, the city glowing behind him like a painting he couldn't touch. The bourbon bottle on the shelf remained unopened. He didn't want to drink. He wanted to understand. What was this feeling? Not just jealousy. It was something deeper. Fear. Maybe. Fear of being replaced. Fear of not mattering. Fear that after everything, Claire would walk away and he wouldn't know how to stop her, because he'd built this company on foundations of control and logic. But none of that worked here. He couldn't spreadsheet his way out of what he felt, and he sure as hell couldn't out-strategize the truth that was clawing its way through his chest. He cared too much, too late. The next morning, Claire arrived earlier than him. She was already seated at her desk, typing, earbuds in. She didn't look up when he walked by. He wanted to say something. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Instead, he stepped into his office and stared at his own reflection in the glass. He saw a man who once thought feeling nothing was strength. Now, he wasn't sure what to do with everything he felt. The rain started sometime before dawn. Not a downpour, just a steady, gentle patter against the tall windows of Elliot Hartman's penthouse, a sound that usually brought him calm. Not tonight. He had been awake for hours, sitting in the dim glow of the living room. The city stretching beyond the glass like 1,000 tiny possibilities he couldn't quite reach. A half-finished glass of bourbon sat untouched on the table beside him. He had spent most of the night thinking about Claire, about her laugh, her silence, her words. I remembered what it felt like to be a person, and about everything he hadn't said. It wasn't that Elliot didn't feel things. He did. Deeply. He just never trusted words the way he trusted action. Actions could be tracked, measured. Words, they were slippery. They could mean everything or nothing at all. But now, his actions. His silence had started to sound a lot like indifference, and Claire was beginning to believe it. At 8:06 a.m., she stepped into his office with the efficiency of habit, carrying the day's schedule. Her voice was neutral. You have a call with Zurich at 9, board prep at 11, and Thomas sent over a revised pitch for the renewable portfolio. It's flagged in your inbox. Elliot nodded, eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. Claire lingered a second longer. Then I'm considering the offer. He looked up, confused. The position Thomas mentioned, she clarified, Chief Strategy Officer at a new venture-backed firm in San Francisco. There was no hesitation in her voice, just clarity. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice low. "I haven't decided. Why are you even entertaining it?" Claire folded her arms. "Because it's an opportunity. And because here, I'm not sure what I'm still building toward." Elliot stood. "You're a part of everything here. I'm a function here," she said, cutting in. "A system that runs well. A schedule that keeps. A voice that calms meetings. You're more than that." "Then why have you never said so?" The question landed like a stone. She continued, her voice quieter now. "You say you don't comment on personal lives. You say you're protecting boundaries. But what you're really doing is hiding." "I'm not hiding." "Yes, you are. From me. From yourself." Elliot walked to the window, arms crossed. "Feelings complicate things. So does silence," she whispered. He turned back. "You're angry. I'm hurt, Elliot, and tired of guessing where I stand, of wondering if I mean anything more to you than a calendar that talks back." His hands clenched at his sides. "You mean more? Then say it." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Claire nodded slowly, stepping toward the door. "That's what I thought." "Claire," he said quickly. She paused. Hand on the knob. "I wanted to protect what we had," he said. "The rhythm. The trust. I didn't want to risk it by saying something I couldn't take back." She turned to face him. "And in trying not to risk it, you've already lost it." The door closed behind her with a soft click. For the rest of the day, Elliot couldn't focus. He read the same line of the Zurich brief 3 times. He sat in meetings and heard none of the questions. By afternoon, he was in his office with the blinds drawn, phone face down, documents untouched. He knew what was happening. He just didn't know how to stop it. Years ago, his ex-wife had said something he never forgot. "You're good at building things, Elliot. You're just not very good at being in them." He hadn't understood what she meant. Now he did. He'd built trust with Claire. Yes, but trust wasn't something you maintained through silence. It needed light and words. It needed to be seen, and he had never let her see him. Not fully, not where it mattered. That evening, Elliot stood at the elevator, unsure why he was hesitating. Claire had already left, he knew that. She'd left at 5 sharp. No lingering, no second glances. Just like someone who had made up her mind. But still, he stood there, waiting. For what he didn't know. For courage, maybe. For the kind of strength that didn't come from strategy, but from honesty. He thought of everything he had said, then of everything he hadn't. And the list of the latter was so much longer. Claire Reynolds had never liked surprises. She preferred structure, plans, certainty. That's what made her so good at her job. She anticipated problems before they arrived, understood people without making them explain themselves. But what she read that morning knocked the air right out of her chest. It was a letter official, folded into thirds, tucked in a plain envelope with the logo of the Boston Trust Foundation. Addressed not to her, but to her brother, Miguel. The return address was vague, but she recognized the letterhead from years before. She hadn't meant to open it. It had come with the rest of her mail, forwarded from the apartment where Miguel used to live before transferring to a dorm. She was sorting bills when the envelope caught her eye. And then she saw the name. Elliot Hartman. Not printed, not signed, but buried 3 paragraphs deep in the body of the letter. described in careful legal terms as the anonymous benefactor who had established and personally funded the Miguel Reynolds Educational Grant through 3 consecutive fiscal years. The scholarship, the tuition, the emergency fund for textbooks and travel, all of it. Claire sat at her kitchen counter, the letter shaking in her hands. The coffee she'd just poured sat cooling beside her, untouched. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense. But it did. Elliot had never once asked about Miguel's tuition, never offered help, never acknowledged the late nights Claire pulled to wire funds or negotiate financial aid deadlines. He just watched. And now she realized he hadn't been ignoring her burden. He'd been carrying it in silence, without asking, without telling, and somehow that hurt more than if he hadn't helped at all, because he had made a decision for her without her voice, without her permission. When Claire walked into the office that afternoon, she didn't take the elevator straight to the 42nd floor. She stopped in the lobby, sat on the velvet bench beneath the glass sculpture she used to admire on rushed mornings, and tried to steady her breath. Her phone buzzed. A message from Miguel. Just got another email from the foundation. I think they added summer classes to the scholarship. Whoever's doing this, I owe them everything. So do you. Claire stared at the screen. Then, slowly, typed back, you don't owe them anything. Miguel, you earned it? But her hand trembled, because what she didn't say was I didn't ask for this. And that silence now lived heavy in her throat. At 3:17 p.m., she walked into Elliot's office. He was reviewing merger forecasts, a pencil balanced between his fingers. He looked up, surprised. Her expression told him this wasn't a routine check-in. She held the letter between 2 fingers. Do you want to explain this? He didn't pretend not to know what it was. He set down the pencil, carefully. Claire stepped closer, placing the letter on his desk. You paid for Miguel's tuition? It wasn't a question. He nodded once. Yes. Why? Elliot leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Because I could. And because I saw how hard you were working to make everything fit. I wanted to help. Claire shook her head slowly. No, you didn't want to help. You wanted to control. Quietly, invisibly. That's not true. Then why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want it to change anything between us. She laughed bitterly. It changed everything the moment you decided to do it without asking. I wasn't trying to make you feel small. But that's what it did. Her voice cracked just slightly. You decided what I needed. You stripped away my ability to choose, to say no, to fight my own battles. I thought it would ease your load. Claire's hands were trembling now, but she didn't hide them. I don't need someone to rescue me. Elliot, I need someone to trust me, to see me. All of me. Even when I'm struggling. He stood slowly. I did see you. Then why couldn't you talk to me? The room felt cavernous. He swallowed hard, because I didn't know how. Because every time I tried to say something real, I panicked. I've spent my whole life fixing things. Quietly. That's how I show I care. You think love is logistics? She said softly. But it's not. It's honesty. Even when it's messy. He looked at her. Really looked. She was tired. Not from lack of sleep. From carrying everything alone for too long. I didn't want you to feel indebted. He said. But I do. she whispered. And that's not love either. A silence stretched between them. Then Claire turned away. I need space, she said. Not because I don't care, but because I do. And right now, I don't know what any of this means anymore. She left without waiting for a reply. And for the first time in a very long time, Elliot felt like the man who had everything except the one thing he didn't know how to ask for. Forgiveness. That night, he opened the file drawer in his study that he hadn't touched in months. Inside were printed letters, scholarship contracts, financial reports, every record of the support he'd arranged for Miguel. He reread the thank you note Miguel had sent 2 years ago, addressed to the board. Whoever made this scholarship possible, thank you. I don't know who you are, but your gift changed my family's life. I won't waste it. Elliot ran a hand over his face. He thought it would feel good, knowing he'd helped, that he'd done something meaningful. But all he felt was the sting of knowing he had done it wrong. He had tried to care without asking what was needed. He had tried to love without ever saying the word. And in doing so, he had hurt the one person he never meant to lose. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Elliot Hartman sat in the leather armchair that had once belonged to his father. The fire was lit, casting soft shadows across the shelves. Above the mantel, the city flickered through the windows, Boston stretching out like a map of missed chances. In his hand, a glass of bourbon. Neat. As always, he hadn't touched it. There was a folder on the table. Inside were 3 pages, the printed resignation letter, the board meeting schedule, and the internal report clearing Claire of any security breaches. All neatly arranged, all meaningless, because none of it could fix what he'd broken. He had spent years learning how to build empires, how to negotiate billion-dollar deals, how to silence a room with a sentence, but he had never learned how to say I hurt you, or worse, I need you. That second one was the confession he couldn't make. Not yet. The next morning came dressed in gray, low clouds, a chill that wrapped around the city like an old regret. Elliot arrived at the office early, but Claire was already there. She sat at her desk, typing, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Her usual coffee sat untouched beside her laptop. He stood in the doorway for a while, unsure if he should speak. She didn't look up. So he stepped inside and left a manila envelope on the corner of her desk. It's the report, he said quietly. It clears you? Formally. Good, she replied. Thank you. He hesitated. Claire. She paused, fingers still on the keyboard. I never meant to take anything from you. She looked up then. Her eyes were calm, but tired. You didn't take anything, she said, but you hid everything. That's worse. He swallowed. I thought I was protecting you. From what she asked gently, from honesty, from the discomfort of asking if I needed help before offering it. I didn't know how to ask. You didn't even try. That landed hard. Not angry. Just true and truth. Elliot was learning. Didn't need to be loud to cut deep. Later that day, during a board meeting prep session, Elliot stood at the conference room window, staring out over a city he no longer felt sure of. Thomas Blake, head of legal, sat across from him, reading from his notes. You've got 2 options, Thomas said plainly. Resign with dignity, or weather the storm and trust the data clears you both. I'm not worried about me, Elliot said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Then what are you worried about? Elliot didn't answer, because what he was really worried about, what had kept him up for nights, was that Claire Reynolds would never look at him the same way again. Not because of the money, not because of the scandal, but because he had watched her drown and thought the right thing to do was to quietly build her a life raft. Instead of reaching out his hand and asking, "Do you want me beside you?" That evening, he didn't go home right away. Instead, he sat in his office, lights off, city glowing just beyond the glass walls. On his desk was the notebook Claire had once left behind, a yellow legal pad filled with her careful handwriting. He flipped through it, not to read, but to remember. Her presence lingered in the smallest details. And then, on the back of one page, in the corner, he found a note scribbled lightly in pencil. Some people don't need saving, just someone who sees them. He stared at that line for a long time. He had read thousands of strategy reports, hundreds of merger breakdowns, endless graphs and forecasts, but nothing had ever struck him as hard or as true as that one sentence. And he knew, in that moment, that it was time to confess, to tell her the whole truth, not just about the scholarship, but about what she had become to him, what he never said, what he couldn't say before, what he'd carry like an anchor if he didn't say it now. That night, Elliot wrote, not an email, not a speech, not a resignation memo, but a letter, ink on paper, no edits, no drafts, just words, honest and flawed and unpracticed. He told her about the day he first noticed her kindness, about how she used to bring him coffee before early meetings, even when she hadn't slept, about how she called his mother on Mother's Day, the year he forgot, about how, the night of the gala, when he saw her dancing with someone else, something in his chest broke not from jealousy, but from realization. I saw you, Claire, not just your work, not just your loyalty, you. He wrote about the scholarship, why he did it, how he thought he was helping, and he ended with the only thing he had never written before. I'm sorry I never said the words you deserve to hear. I love you. I've loved you longer than I know how to admit. He signed it, Elliot. Then he sealed it in an envelope, walked to her desk, and left it there beneath her favorite pen. No fanfare, no explanation, just the truth. Finally, the next morning arrived with the kind of golden sunlight that made the city look softer than it really was. But inside Hartman & Co., the air remained heavy. Elliot Hartman didn't sleep. He had stayed in his apartment, pacing between windows, checking his phone every 10 minutes, half hoping for a message that didn't come. The letter was out there now. There was nothing else to hide behind. Still, as he walked into the office that morning, dressed a touch more deliberately pressed shirt, a different tie than usual, he carried no expectations. But as he passed Claire Reynolds' desk, his heart dropped. The letter was still there, unopened, untouched, sitting neatly where he left it, as if it had been ignored on purpose. Claire wasn't at her desk, and for a moment, Elliot stood still, an executive frozen mid-step. His throat tightened. He forced himself to keep walking into his glass office, pretending he hadn't noticed, but he had. God, he tried to work, tried to read the report from Thomas Blake, tried to refocus on the pending board decision and the fallout from Noah's sabotage. But the unopened letter burned in his memory like a sunspot behind the eyes. Maybe she didn't want to read it. Maybe he was too late. Maybe she didn't believe in second chances. Claire had arrived early, but not to her usual post. She was in the small conference room by the 22nd floor break lounge alone, staring at her own reflection in the dark screen of the turned-off monitor. The envelope sat in her lap. She hadn't read it yet. Couldn't. Not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, feeling the slight ridge where Elliot had pressed too hard with his pen. It wasn't like him. He was always controlled, measured, unshakable. But this felt human. And that scared her more than anything. Because it wasn't the lies that had hurt her the most. It was the silence. It was standing beside a man for 3 years, sharing her best self, her loyalty, her time, and never knowing if she had meant anything more than her usefulness. He had said nothing for so long. And now there were words. But did they mean something? Or were they just too late? By mid-morning, Elliot was back to pacing. The board meeting had been postponed by an hour due to a shareholder delay. The air was full of tension, the kind you could feel in your bones. He couldn't focus. Every time he tried to look at the merger projections, the same thought echoed through him. What if she leaves? It was different now. It wasn't about damage control or professional image. It wasn't even about trust in the traditional sense. It was personal. He needed her not just for balance sheets or schedule juggling, but because she grounded him in a way no one else ever had. And if she walked out of this building for good, Elliot wasn't sure what kind of man he'd be left with. By noon, Claire finally moved. She returned to her desk like nothing had changed, hair tucked behind one ear, tablet in hand, calm on the outside. The envelope was still in her hand. Elliot caught the movement through his glass wall. She hadn't left it behind. She'd taken it with her. And that meant something, didn't it? She glanced toward his office. Their eyes met, briefly. Then she looked down again. He stood, his chest tight. He walked to her, stopped just short of the desk. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know." She nodded, not cold, not distant, just quiet. "Thank you for the truth," she replied, her voice soft. "I should have said it earlier." "You should have," she agreed. Another pause. "Claire," he said, carefully, "do you still—" "I don't know," she interrupted gently. "I haven't read it yet." She held up the envelope slightly, as if showing him a fragile object. "I want to read it when I'm ready, not when you are." That stung, but only because it was fair. "I understand," he said. And he did. That afternoon, the board meeting resumed, this time with new clarity. Thomas Blake presented the forensic security report, linking Noah Green's access to a cloned device. Claire's name was formally cleared. Investor confidence began to stabilize. Harrison Clean didn't show up. The board didn't vote. Instead, they extended Elliot's contract with conditions for transparency and a newly approved oversight committee. Elliot accepted the terms with a clear voice and an unusual humility. He didn't celebrate. There were more important things than corporate survival. When he returned to his office, Claire's desk was empty again. But this time, the letter was gone. Gone. Not discarded. Not unopened. Gone. And in that strange, fragile moment, Elliot allowed himself the smallest breath of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the middle. That evening, Elliot walked the long way home. No driver, no car, just his hands in his pockets, the weight of the city folding around him like an old coat. When he reached his building, there was a small envelope waiting with the concierge. His name, written in her handwriting. Inside was a note, short, direct, in Claire's voice. I read it. I believed it. But trust takes time. I'm not gone. Elliot, just not ready. Yet. He held the note in both hands like something breakable. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel abandoned. He felt seen. And that was enough. For now. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Claire Reynolds returned to work, on time and composed, just like before. But something was different. Something subtle. She didn't bring Elliot coffee in the mornings anymore, not out of spite. Just space. She answered his questions with clarity, brief and professional, but no longer with the warmth that once lingered between words. No soft jokes, no shared glances. And Elliot Hartman, he didn't press. He gave her the room she had asked for. No letters, no conversations beyond the necessary, just presence, steady, respectful. It was excruciating, not because she was cruel, but because she was kind, distantly kind. And that hurt more than anger ever could. One Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the board meeting, a storm swept across Boston. Rain drummed hard against the windows of the executive suite. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The office thinned out early, but Claire remained. So did Elliot. They were the last two in the building. Again. She was at her desk, reviewing updated contracts. He was at his, trying not to stare. Eventually, the silence felt too large. He stepped out of his office, stopping a few feet from her desk. Claire! She looked up. Yes. Could we talk? She set her pen down, studied his face for a second too long. Now. He nodded. She considered, then stood. He gestured toward the break room neutral territory. She followed, her heels tapping quietly on the tile. Inside. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and lemon cleaner. A flickering light above the sink buzzed softly. He leaned against the counter. She sat at the small table. Neither spoke for a moment, until Elliot broke. I miss you. The words weren't rehearsed. They just fell. Claire blinked, but didn't look away. I'm still here, she said calmly. You are, he agreed. But not really. She exhaled. And whose fault is that? His shoulders sagged slightly. Mine. He looked at her, eyes steady. I didn't just fail to say what mattered. I failed to see what you were carrying. You showed up for me every day, and I never asked if you had anything left for yourself. Claire didn't reply right away, but the silence between them was different now. Not tense, not cold, just real. You know, she said finally, the first time I considered quitting was almost a year ago. Elliot's stomach dropped. What stopped you? She looked at him, not accusing, just honest. You smiled at me. He blinked. That's it. She gave a small shrug. It wasn't much. But it was the first time I thought maybe you saw me, not just my work. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry I made that rare. Claire nodded, accepting, not dismissing. I'm not asking for perfect, Elliot, she said softly. Just presence? Just honesty? He looked down. You'll have it. If you still want to be here. Her gaze didn't waver. I wouldn't have come back if I didn't. Later that night, Elliot stood in his apartment by the window. The rain had stopped. Boston glistened below, puddles reflecting streetlights like melted gold. He held a mug of tea, not bourbon. It was new. A quiet promise to himself. A small beginning. The air still felt heavy, but not unbearable. Because for the first time in weeks, something had shifted. Not everything was fixed, but not everything was broken, either. There was a bridge still standing. It had cracks, but it hadn't collapsed. And maybe, just maybe, it could carry them both. The next day, something changed. Claire brought him coffee, just like before. But this time, there was no smile, no words, just a small, yellow sticky note on the lid. One day at a time. Elliot stared at it for a long time, then smiled. Genuinely. He left the note on his desk, where he could see it every time he looked up from his work. Sometimes, healing didn't come with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes, it came with a cup of coffee and 5 quiet words. And that was enough. For now, it was spring again. Boston wore a softer light. The trees along Commonwealth Avenue had begun to bloom. Pale pink and white petals fluttering in the breeze, like they'd been waiting for forgiveness, too. The Hartman Foundation was hosting its annual gala. Same ballroom, same music, same glittering lights. But Elliot Hartman was not the same man who had stood by the bar 2 years earlier, holding a bourbon he never touched, watching Claire dance with someone else. This time, he stood near the entrance. He had arrived early. Not for the press, not for the donors. For her. And she was late. He smiled to himself. It felt like balance. When Claire Reynolds did arrive, she didn't make a grand entrance. She walked in like she always had, quiet, poised, present. Her green dress moved with her like a memory. Elliot watched her cross the room, each step echoing something familiar and something new. When their eyes met, there was no hesitation, no game. He walked toward her. She didn't move, just smiled. "You're early," she teased gently. "And you're late?" he returned. "Balance," she said. "Finally," he replied. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by music and laughter and voices, but in their space. It was still. Then Claire leaned in, her voice low. "I saw the new scholarship list." Elliot raised an eyebrow. 37 this year. "You beat your own record." "It wasn't mine alone." She smiled, more fully now. "It never was it?" He shook his head. "Nothing worth keeping ever is." Later that evening, after the speeches and toasts and polished conversations had faded into softer tones, Elliot found Claire near the balcony doors. She stood alone, looking out at the skyline. He approached without speaking. She didn't turn. "You used to hate these events," she said. "I still do," he replied, "but I like who I get to come with now." She looked at him then, fully, softly. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" He considered that. "Not exactly, but I think some part of me always hoped." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "A dance card." Elliot blinked. "I didn't know people still use those." "They don't," she said, "but I'm old-fashioned that way." He opened it. her name, the date, one slot filled. His, just his. I never got my dance that night, she said. No, he said, stepping closer. But maybe it's not too late. She nodded once. I hope not. He offered his hand. She took it. They walked back into the ballroom. No one announced them. No spotlight. Just a jazz quartet playing something slow and familiar. He placed one hand gently on her waist. She rested hers on his shoulder. And they moved, not like professionals, not like they had rehearsed it, but like they belonged exactly where they were. I thought about leaving, Claire whispered as they swayed. I know, Elliot said. I thought about stopping you. You didn't. You needed to know you could choose. She met his eyes. And you needed to learn how to ask. He smiled. I'm still learning. Me too, she said. They danced until the music faded, until the lights dimmed a little lower, until the world outside the ballroom didn't seem so heavy. At the end of the night, Elliot walked Claire to her car. Rain had begun to fall again, soft and quiet. She opened the door, then turned to him. So, she said, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. What happens next? Elliot hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something better care. I don't know exactly, he said, but I'd like to find out. Claire studied him for a beat. Then, with the smallest, most powerful smile, she replied, one day at a time. He nodded, one day at a time, and she got into the car. But before closing the door, she leaned forward, voice barely above the rain. You still owe me coffee tomorrow. He grinned. I'll bring two. She closed the door. And for the first time in a long, long time, Elliot Hartman didn't feel alone. He felt understood. And that, in the end, was everything. At its heart, this wasn't just a story about power or pride. It wasn't even about a millionaire and his assistant. It was about timing and silence. And all the things we leave unsaid until it's almost too late. It was about how sometimes love doesn't need to shout to be true. It only needs to be heard. So if there's someone you still think of, someone you still want to dance with, even after all the storms, don't wait for the perfect moment. Create one. Because sometimes the most beautiful things begin with 5 words on a coffee cup. Sometimes the deepest regrets aren't about what we did, but about what we didn't say. This story reminds us that love doesn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it shows up in the quiet routines, in the coffee left on your desk, in the way someone protects your peace without asking for credit. But silence, when left too long, can become a wall. And even the strongest bonds can fray when we assume others already know how we feel, especially as we grow older. We often think it's too late. Too late to say I need you. Too late to admit I was afraid. But truth has no expiration date, and healing begins the moment we dare to speak. So, if there's someone you care about, say it. If you've been carrying silence, let it go. Because the most meaningful legacy we leave behind is not our titles or wealth. It's the people we chose to love out loud. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched something in your heart, if you saw a part of yourself in it, we're truly honored. Your support helps us bring more quiet, meaningful stories to life, stories that heal, connect, and remind us we're not alone. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. It only takes a moment, but it means the world to us. We'll be here with the next story when you're ready. Take care and be gentle with your heart.